Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a catastrophic clash of empires that literally changed the medieval world forever. We are traveling all the way back to the 11th century to witness the Battle of Manzikert. And look, I know that name might not be on the tip of everyone's tongue, but it absolutely should be. This wasn't just a typical military defeat, it was an absolute earthquake. It fractured a millennium-old superpower and completely redrew the map of the Middle East and Europe.
So we really have to ask ourselves, how exactly did a single afternoon of betrayal manage to shatter a 1,000-year empire and ignite the Crusades? That is the provocative question at the very heart of the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. We so often think of history as this slow, inevitable march of time, right? But here, we have a scenario where one single afternoon, and honestly, the treacherous, backstabbing decisions made by a handful of men in the fading twilight literally altered the destiny of entire civilizations.
Section 1. The Clash of Empires. Okay, let's set the stage. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire, which was really the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, had been the undisputed superpower of the region. But things had gone downhill fast. Following the death of Emperor Basil II, the empire basically suffered through decades of political rot. We're talking neglected militaries and constant internal rebellions. And right as the Byzantines were at their most vulnerable, a fierce new power exploded onto the scene from the east, the Seljuk Turks. These were a nomadic people from Central Asia who had recently united under Sunni Islam, and their territory was expanding like wildfire. By 1064, the tension was off the charts when the Seljuks completely sacked the great city of Ani, crashing right through the empire's vital eastern buffer zone. Recognizing this as a massive existential threat, a hardened military man named Romanos IV Diogenes took the throne in 1068. He tried, desperately, to rebuild this neglected, fractured army. And by 1071, Romanos decided he had to put an end to these Seljuk raids once and for all. So he marched his massive army eastward to the fortress of Manzikert.
Section 2. Rivals on the battlefield.
The absolutely crucial thing to understand before this clash is the sheer unbelievable contrast between these two sides. It's like a heavyweight boxer stepping into the ring with a gymnast. Emperor Romanos relied on massive, heavily armored infantry and heavy cavalry. It was a powerful, bruising force, but incredibly slow-moving. Opposing him was Sultan Alp Arslan, and his name literally translates to heroic lion, which is pretty intimidating on its own. The Sultan commanded a highly mobile force of steppe horse archers. The Seljuks completely rejected the idea of heavy armor and pitched face-to-face melee combat. Instead, they relied on blinding speed, relentless harassment, and a tightly unified chain of command that the Byzantines quite frankly desperately lacked.
At the start of his campaign, Romanos fielded an impressive force of around 40,000 men. Now, on paper, that's an absolute juggernaut. It sounds terrifying, but the reality was way messier. It was a deeply divided multinational army. Because previous emperors had basically let the native military fall apart, Romanos was heavily, dangerously reliant on foreign mercenaries. He had Normans, Franks, Bulgars, and even Turkic steppe warriors in his ranks. And worse still, the army was completely riddled with political factions. You had rival noble families actively plotting against the emperor right there in the war camp.
Section 3. The trap is set. So, as the Byzantines marched blindly toward Lake Van in August of 1071, a series of just disastrous intelligence failures set a deadly trap. Romanos was absolutely convinced that Alp Arslan was miles and miles away in Syria, busy fighting the Fatimid Caliphate. He had no clue, none, that the Sultan had actually abandoned his siege in the south and force-marched his entire army directly to the Armenian border. Believing the enemy was far away, Romanos made a fatal tactical blunder. He tragically split his 40,000-man army right down the middle. He sent around 20,000 men under General Yosef Tarkaniotes to secure a nearby fortress. But that secondary force marched directly into Alp Arslan's arriving army, and instead of, fighting or even sending word back to warn the emperor, that entire 20,000-man division panicked and fled the region. So Romanos lost literally half his army before the battle even started, totally unaware that the enemy was already there watching his every move.
The tension just skyrocketed on the eve of the battle.
Out of nowhere, Byzantine foraging parties started getting ambushed by Seljuk archers. Then, during this dark, moonless night between August 24th and 25th, an absolute disaster struck the Byzantine camp. Remember those Turkic mercenaries Romanos hired, the Uzes? Well, they recognized their ethnic and linguistic kin across the battlefield. So, in the dead of night, entire contingents of them just packed up and defected to the Seljuk side. Despite these terrifying setbacks, Romanos actually rejected a peace envoy from the Sultan. Why? Because he believed he needed a massive, decisive military victory to secure his really fragile political power back in the capital. Now, to understand the slaughter that was about to unfold, we have to talk about the classic step tactic the Seljuks used to bait the Byzantines. It's known as the feigned retreat, and it's brilliant. Here's how it works. The Seljuk horse archers would ride up, unleash a devastating, terrifying hail of arrows, and then suddenly pretend to panic and flee. When the frustrated Byzantine heavy cavalry inevitably broke their discipline to chase after them, the Seljuks would lure them deep into the rugged foothills. And that's where the hidden reinforcements were waiting to spring the trap, completely surrounding and annihilating the overextended units.
Section 4. Betrayal and Collapse.
All right, we've reached the climax. August 26th, 1071. Romanos gathered his remaining men into a massive, heavily disciplined three-line formation in order to general advance. And for a while on that fateful afternoon, total victory actually seemed to be right within the Byzantines' grasp. What makes this battle so wild is the constantly swinging momentum. Alp Arslan set up his army in this loose, crescent formation, completely refusing to engage in direct hand-to-hand combat. So as the Seljuks constantly backed away, firing arrows over their shoulders, the disciplined Byzantine heavy infantry just kept relentlessly pushing forward. By late afternoon, the emperor's massive center division had actually pushed the Seljuks back for miles. They even captured Alp Arslan's empty command camp.
But then, the sun starts going down. And that late hour brought terrible, terrible danger. Romanos recognized that his lines were getting dangerously stretched out, his men were exhausted, and they were sitting ducks for a night attack by the highly mobile Turks. So he made the logical but incredibly risky decision to order a withdrawal. He had the imperial standard reversed, which was the visual command for the entire army to execute a slow, orderly countermarch back to the safety of their fortified camp.
You probably guess what happened next. Executing a perfectly coordinated retreat with a massive, multilingual army in the fading light? Nearly impossible. The complex maneuver instantly sparked mass confusion. Troops on the flanks misunderstood the reverse standard. They actually thought the emperor had been killed. Panic started spreading like a virus. Massive gaps ripped open in the Byzantine lines, and Sultan Alp Arslan, who was watching all of this unfold from a nearby hill, instantly seized the moment. He sprang his trap, slamming his hidden cavalry reserves directly into those fracturing Byzantine wings. Even with the wings collapsing, the Byzantines honestly could have survived if their rear guard had just stepped up to cover the retreat. But here comes the absolute gut punch of the whole battle. It was pure, calculated treachery. The vital reserve line was commanded by a guy named Andronikos Doukas, who happened to be a bitter political rival of Romanos. Doukas saw the chaos unfolding, and instead of charging in to engage the enemy and save his emperor, Doukas spread a false rumor that Romanos was already dead. He turned his entire division around and deliberately marched his troops right off the battlefield, leaving the emperor out there to be slaughtered.
What followed was a scene of just absolute tragic heroism. Left completely isolated without any reserves, Romanos' center division was totally swallowed up by the Seljuk swarm. Romanos and his elite, axe-wielding Varangian guard fought a legendary, bloody last stand. These fierce warriors fought like possessed men. They formed a circle, defending their sovereign to the bitter, bloody end, until Romanos' own horse was killed beneath him, his sword hand was badly wounded, and the unhorsed emperor was finally, inevitably, captured.
Section 5. The Captive Emperor.
So the battle was lost, but the immediate aftermath led to one of the most spectacular, surprising, and honestly legendary interactions in all of military history. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had been taken prisoner on the battlefield. When the exhausted, dirt-covered Romanos was dragged in chains before Alp Arslan, the Sultan forced the emperor to kiss the ground and symbolically placed his boot right on his neck. But then, Alp Arslan asked Romanos a fascinating question. What would you do if our positions were reversed? Romanos bluntly replied that he would have the Sultan killed or paraded through the streets in chains. And in a stunning display of mercy, Alp Arslan replied, "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you and set you free." He literally spared Romanos from execution and treated him as an honored royal guest.
Over the next week, the two leaders sat down and negotiated a surprisingly lenient peace. They agreed to a massive initial ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces for the emperor's life, plus an annual tribute, the surrender of a few border fortresses, and a marriage alliance. Now, 1.5 million gold pieces is a staggering fortune, but on paper, it was a treaty that could have theoretically saved the Byzantine Empire from total collapse.
Section 6. Legacy of Manzikert.
But here is the grand tragedy of Manzikert. The real disaster wasn't the battle itself. The casualties for the Byzantines were actually surprisingly low, all things considered. No, the fatal blow was the catastrophic political fallout that exploded the second Romanos returned home. Remember Andronikos Doukas, the general who backstabbed Romanos on the battlefield? Well, he had rushed back to Constantinople and helped his own family usurp the throne. When Romanos finally made it back, his own subjects waged a brutal civil war against him. He was defeated, horribly blinded by his political enemies, and ultimately left to die of his infected wounds. And to make matters infinitely worse, the usurpers arrogantly nullified the peace treaty Romanos had just signed with the Seljuks.
By breaking that treaty, the Byzantines basically gave the Seljuks a giant green light to invade. And because the Byzantine armies were entirely too busy fighting each other in this bloody civil war, the eastern borders were left completely unguarded. It was an open door. Nomadic Seljuk tribes poured into Anatolia unopposed. And they didn't just raid and leave, they settled down. In less than a decade, Byzantium permanently lost its agricultural and military heartland. It completely stripped the empire of its primary source of wealth and manpower.
Fast forward just a couple of decades later, the empire was facing total geographic collapse. The Seljuks had established a capital just a few days' march from Constantinople itself. A new Byzantine emperor, named Alexios Komnenos, realized he had absolutely no choice left. He sent a desperate plea for help to Pope Urban II over in Western Europe, basically begging for a few thousand mercenaries to help hold the line. But instead of just sending a small relief force, the Pope used this plea to ignite a holy war. This one cry for help launched the massive, world-altering First Crusade.
And it's crazy to think about, but it all traces back to that one fateful afternoon on the dusty plains of Manzikert. It leaves us with this final staggering thought. How might the entire landscape of world history, the borders of the modern Middle East, and the entire relationship between East and West look today if Andronikos Doukas had simply followed his orders, held the line, and protected his emperor? Well, thank you so much for exploring this incredible, defining moment in history with me.